Modernizing COBOL applications. Why should companies consider modernizing these applications? COBOL applications still are probably are the most popular and most abundant applications in the world. The original business computing and applications were only COBOL. That was the first general purpose high-level language that came around probably around the 60s. And it ran for many years, and before the personal computer revolution and the web, everything was written in COBOL, mostly on a IBM mainframe that was sitting in some data center somewhere, and people, there was no internet, and people were, our businesses and all walks that were automating were, writing COBOL applications to automate the businesses. Earlier applications that were built were for like payroll. The original application for the first computer was a census, the government census. Computing was relegated to the government. Probably besides missile trajectories and military uses, they were code breaking and things like that. They got into IBM got them into the business world with for the government for calculating the census, and then from there on, it was probably payroll and accounting and any kind of processing that needed to happen in an automated fashion. And COBOL was probably the language that they wrote that on. That went on for a couple decades at least, and then in probably the mid-80s, the personal computer revolution came around, where PCs started making an appearance, and that wasn't anything that was initially most IT departments, because I was part of one of those IT departments as a Fortran programmer, which is like COBOL, but same class of programming language, running on a mainframe. Our IT professionals thought that personal computers were a toy, right? That people would, play asteroids on, or Pong or something like that on the side. But what happened were people were started bringing in the spreadsheet, I guess, was the first thing that was invented, right? Somebody came up with a spreadsheet, and that changed everything. And people started doing all kinds of business calculations and automation on spreadsheets. That started probably the PC revolution, as we know where it is today. However, all these COBOL applications were still being built, and are still being built today, actually, because of the horsepower that the mainframe offers. They from a processing power, they're not really the modern chipsets on our personal computers nowadays are way more than the processing power of a mainframe from IBM. But the throughput, the pipe, say the data pipe the amount of data they can process, a mainframe beats a personal computer or a server still to this day. They can process large data sets very fast, and that's what they're good for. And that's what they're doing now. An example would be processing transactions for a bank and closing or a mutual fund or a financial institution. That's what mainframes are relegated to nowadays. Closing out books, these big mainframes in the banks and financial institutions are processing in a batch mode lots of data, way faster than a personal computer could, or even a server farm, but they can just read large data sets and process through them. Now, that's where they live now. That's their popularity. That's still going on to this day. So why should a company leave that? First off, they're very expensive. IBM, you don't own the mainframe, you lease a mainframe. So all these organizations that have a mainframe are leasing that from IBM. They don't own them. I think they're very expensive. I don't have hardcore numbers. Last time I think it can be upwards of $1 million, or sometimes $1 million a year, maybe $1 million a month. They're very expensive, but they're running these core business functions for businesses throughout the world. The problem is talent is one. We're not really teaching COBOL in schools anymore. I mean, when you go to the university to study computer science or information systems, they have COBOL in some universities, I believe, but they're not teaching that. That's not running the world. So the population of talent is dwindling by the day. Probably baby boomers are the most prolific COBOL programmers, and maybe some greatest generation folks are smattered in there, and they are retiring. I think 10,000 people a day are retiring. So there's a lot of COBOL out there that still has to be maintained and care and fed. There's not new folks coming in behind. The Y2K movement kind of exposed that. the turn of the century. We thought that there's going to be we had problems with data fields that were built prior to 2000, and a lot of COBOL programs had to update that, and so that was where they needed a lot of COBOL talent to go back and rewrite these programs, and that was the first bellwether to where we have a shortage, because there's a lot of COBOL programmers that did really well because they could charge what they wanted for their fee and use COBOL programming. So the talent is short. New folks aren't learning how to do it, nor do they want to do it, because it's a quandary for somebody in a career. If they learn COBOL and then it goes away, their language skills are going to be deficient, because it is a older procedural style language. It doesn't have some of the modern idioms that modern programming languages have, so you kind of can hinder your programming acumen a little bit. This cost is causing a lot of people to rethink. Now modern computing with Moore's law, the processing power, where it increases double every year. That's a law in computing where the computers get more powerful every year. Chipsets get more powerful, processors get more powerful. So that has caused that gap to close from personal computers and server farms being able to process the large amounts of data efficiently like a mainframe would. A lot of companies want to modernize, but there's been years and years and years and years of code that is running their business efficiently. It's doing the job, it's just expensive. And if they have to make new enhancements to new regulations or new business rules or laws, they have to go into COBOL and modify that. So there's a pressure there to get off these old mainframes for cost and for efficiency. And so people are doing it, but it's a tall order, right? Because it takes a long time to do it, but it's doable. And the way we recommend is, the first thing is to find a framework or an architecture. Java Spring Batch is built for this. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about mostly batch processing requirements. A lot of the online stuff has already made its way off the mainframe. Online meaning like when you have user interface and you're interacting with it. In the old days, that wasn't a browser or a PC, it was a terminal. Those are online, real-time type of applications. The majority of those have already moved off the mainframe, but the batch processing has not. That's where it really shines. But now there's frameworks available in general purpose modern languages and infrastructure that you can equate to the what COBOL can run on running on a mainframe. So, but the process of doing that is expensive and time consuming. What we recommend is to do a assessment of the COBOL applications, do an inventory of what they're doing, and then we recommend rewriting them, right? There's other people that have software that will take those COBOL applications and generate a modern language out of it. Our experience with that has been negative. It does work. It will generate a new program, but really you're just kicking a problem down the road because of what we refer to as technical debt. The code that is generated by these code converters is very hard to maintain. And so it's really hard. It's not a well-structured application. Now, I'll say that with a little caveat. The recent AI initiatives have eased that pain a little bit. So code generators have come a long way, but the pre 2022 code generators are basically just move your problem. You get off the mainframe and you do have this application running on a modern software stack and infrastructure stack, but the COBOL is very, very hard to maintain. It's not well defined, not maintainable. So you still have a problem. So we recommend rewriting these applications one by one. And what we found, which is really interesting, is that in many cases, a lot of these programs become dormant or zombied. They're running, but they since they were so interplayed together, it was very hard to remove them. So organizations just kept adding COBOL programs and add programs to run in their batch processing mode, and they didn't want to, because they were coupled. So by moving one out, it could have caused some problems down the line. So it just kept adding to them. So what we found is, if you do the research and you just understand these programs and then use the COBOL listing or source code as your spec for the modern developer, and then rewrite that into a modern platform like Spring Batch. A lot of those programs were just no longer needed, so they just were shipped out the door and they weren't required, which caused your batch processing window to come down. So maybe you had 100 programs that were running at night for your business uses, go down to 75, which causes that to happen quicker and more efficiently. And so that was a kind of positive side effect of rewriting these applications instead of just lifting and shifting them somewhere on a new platform or having to convert over. You can also, there are some ways of running COBOL applications on a modern infrastructure. That's fine, but you still have the problem of still COBOL. That was a positive. So we recommend having a modern architecture identified for batch processing, something like Spring Batch, and then using the current COBOL listings and source code as your specification, and then having a development team rewrite that in a modern language. And we found that domain knowledge is captured in these COBOL programs, and it's fairly easy to do that. And that's where some of these automation tools using AI are happening, where you take a COBOL program and you can kind of feed it into it and piecemeal it over into a modern language. That's what we feel is the most effective way. If you have any questions, we've done this for some organizations and have some birds of a feather type information. If you're interested in talking to us, just feel free to reach out to ask the team at keyholesoftware.com.